Thank you everyone for joining Darien Library this afternoon for New York National Historic Sites and the History They Tell. We are currently in week 3, and do not worry if you have not attended week 1 or 2. You can bounce around, pick and choose topics, or stick with us for the whole 8 weeks. We're joined today by Alan Despres as he shares a story about the African burial ground and slavery in New York from the 17th century through the 18th century. We're going to learn how New York City became the second largest slaveholding city in North America and second only to Charleston, which I was surprised to hear. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. I hope everyone is ready to learn about this topic. Before I pass the mic over to Alan, I want to remind you that next week at this time, we're going to be learning about the Hamilton Grange, which I'm excited about. Hey, Alan, take it away.
I hope everyone is well. Thanks for sticking with me. And if you're new, thanks for trying it. We're on the African burial ground. As you go along, you'll see how all of these sites are really interconnected. Slavery, the enslaved is part of the history of America and the United States. So it's going to be an important subject. Almost every site in New York talks about it, or enslavement and its remnants are a part of it. You're looking now at the African burial ground monument, and you'll see the triangular top of that section, that first section, which is to look like a ship, and that ship would be bringing the enslaved to America, to the Americas. There's a door on the other side, on the base there, and that is to reflect upon the castle or fort in Africa, in West Africa, where the slaves entered and were often kept in that structure for a long time, sometimes months, until ships came, and when that happened, they were loaded upon them, so they'd go out the other side. So you'd come in one door and come out another, and if you can imagine that, and get right on the ships. So that is reflecting that. The circular area below is the libation section, and libation was the important part of the religion of the African tribes. Many of them did that, which was actually pouring out a liquid substance on the ground where your ancestor was buried, and you either wanted to mollify them if they were out to get you, or to praise them and to give them offerings if you wanted them on your side and they loved you. And water or liquid was a strong part of the spirits being able to travel between a place to place. So, and also, as you go towards the big white building, the Ted Weiss building right there, it's hard to see now, but there are 7 mounds, and each one of those mounds, I believe, have 60 burials. And so it comes up to 419. The last mound, I believe, only has 59. So that was all symbolic, and we'll talk about that a little later. Before we go on, I would like to say something about the significance of this burial site. First of all, it's one of the largest archaeological sites in North America. And it is very important for that reason, not only for the remains of individuals there, which can be studied scientifically, studying the bones. You can actually find remnants of some of the minerals, and those minerals reflect the areas that they came from. So you can actually trace them back. Also age, sex, you don't need bones to do that. But and how perhaps it shows how many were mistreated by malnutrition, deformed bones, etc. So it's an important archaeological thing. And the artifacts themselves, the things, the remnants that people were buried with, are important to show how the slaves, the enslaved, were living in New York, and actually some of the things that were important to the slaveholders as well. In 1991, construction for the Ted Weiss building, that large structure that I was just talking about at 290 Broadway, started. And they started to find, as they dug down, and there were several levels they were digging through, because the land that the African burial ground was on was sort of in a sunken area. And so it went down. And after the burial ground closed, I believe in the 1790s, it was filled in by the original owners of a property, not the family, the original family that still held it, and let the African burial ground be there, started filling that in and building structures on it. And as time went by, more structures were built, torn down, and added, so more landfill. So they went down several layers. And so what to do about this? Eventually, over the next 2 years, an acre of 6.6, 1 acre of the 6.6 cemetery, that's how many acres it was originally, was evacuated. And below that evacuated area, there's an estimated more remains. How many, we don't know. But 419 were uncovered, and then they stopped. But in the meantime, excavated, I was using the wrong term, sorry about that, excavated instead of what I was saying. But in 1991-92, the African-American community in New York, some of their descendants living there since colonial times, politicians, scientists, historians, wanted to stop these excavations. And so there were protests, 24-hour vigils, and Congress stopped the construction, and they had panels set up and asked the community to come, and they had politicians and scientists, etc., to talk about what they were going to do. And so it was decided that before anything could be done in this area, the remains that they had found, as many as 419, and they decided to stop, as I said, because they didn't think anything could be accomplished. Those remains were moved to Howard University in Washington, D.C., where they were studied. They studied at the Cobb Laboratory, and their analysis touched on history, physical anthropology, the burial ground itself, and human remains, as well as the remains of archaeology as well, artifacts. Bones and burials, objects studied, and they revealed this information about life of African Americans. So, 1993, it was made official, the burial ground, the 1 acre of land, was preserved by New York City to wait to see what the federal government would do. October 2003, the remains were brought back from Howard University, placed in mahogany coffins, from Ghana, kente cloth. It was put in there as well, and this is where the remains were placed. Then there was a 6-day rites of ancestral return, and a procession went from Washington through Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, Newark, New Jersey, and finally New York City. They came up, the 7 earthen mounds were dug up and the graves were put in there. You'll see pictures of that. And 2005, an outdoor memorial design was selected. The idea was a cosmogram and a crossroads of rebirth in the Congo tradition, feminine and masculine forms, and it was inspired by art, music, poetry. All of those things would be touched on in this memorial. And it was oriented towards the sun on the east, on an east-west axis. Now, February 2006, it became a national monument that was created by presidential proclamation. October 5th, 2007, it was opened to the public. Here is the removal of the remains to Howard University, and this was a procession recognizing that. This is some of the excavations that were going on. That's Mayor Dinkins, pardon me, who was mayor at the time, 1990s, excuse me, not 1790s. And we have some of the diggings going on here. And I have a little bit more information about that. Let me see if I have it quickly. If not, we'll just move on. Just bear with me for a second. Well, it doesn't seem that I have it, but that's okay. As you see, they are digging out the grave sites and even working at night with the lighting. That's all that tells you. And of course, here are some of the scientific studies at Howard University, measuring, chemical analysis, physical analysis, studying some of the things I talked about already, which would teeth even, the joints, which would reflect a great deal of wear and tear. They do for all of us. The more you have, the more physical labor. With poor nutrition, it shows. Now, we'll get off that now and talk about founding of New Amsterdam. We'll start with a picture of, I think I might have used this last week for Federal Hall. And you see New Amsterdam as it looked under the Dutch. An artist's rendition. I don't know when this was done. I'm sure it wasn't done in the 17th century at all. An artist's rendition of the harbor. Now, New Amsterdam was settled in 1624. Little information here. You see Native Americans and some Dutch gentlemen looking over the pelts, the beaver pelts. That was the main reason for the Dutch West India Company. You probably heard of the Dutch East India Company. Some of you have heard of the Dutch West Indian Company, West North America, not Asia, obviously. And so this was the biggest draw. So it was a company town. Beaver pelts is what they wanted to send back to Europe, sell it when through Holland. All right, now everybody in New Amsterdam worked for the Dutch West India Company. You could settle there and trap furs, but you had to hand it over, sell it to the company. And the Dutch West India Company had created factory posts in other parts of the world as well. China, coast of West Africa, India, and Malaysia. Now, in 1626, the first slaves appeared. And they were 11 gentlemen. And most likely, I believe they were taken from a Portuguese ship. Some of them have Portuguese names: Manuel de Garrett de Roos, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, Garcia, Peter Santome. So this tells me that they perhaps came from West Africa and they were sailors, because the Portuguese had colonies there, basically trading posts. So these slaves were captured and might have been free at the time. but they certainly were not free when they got to New Amsterdam. They were sold to the Dutch West India Company, and the Dutch West India Company owned the enslaved as they owned everything else. So this wasn't individuals that were owning the slaves. It was the company itself, and they were to work for them. Now, this is a nice long list of the things they did. Clearing land in forests, you could read them. I'm not going to read them all. Building and repairing houses, transporting salt and iron and other commodities. They did artisans and craft work, because many of these enslaved then and in the future had skills that they did in Africa. And they also did the heavy physical labor. They built Fort Amsterdam, helped with the farming. And now when there was danger, they actually armed them and to help defend the town against Native American attacks. They constructed a wagon road between New Amsterdam and Haarlem, that's going uptown today. And they helped build defenses to protect the colony from the expected British invasion of 1664. England and Holland were great competitors in the 17th century and had several wars. I believe at one point the English did conquer New Amsterdam, gave it back, but finally, in 1664, the Dutch were out completely. And now, there was going to be some differences between African enslavement by the Dutch and that by the English. And we'll talk about that. But they were in court records, they were marked as slaves. They could be sold at auction. And there's a couple of interesting things here. These are ordinances that included the general population of the town, but it says each and everyone must refrain from fighting, adulterous intercourse with heathens, blacks, or other persons. So there was a distinction by race. Obviously, you were not to have any intercourse with another race. And anyone convicted of drawing a knife, and they were talking about the white folks, had to work 3 months with the Negroes in chains. All right, and they could also be sold for any reason. Now, before we get into that, I want to go into some of the distinctions between the enslaved and the general population. The enslaved could marry. This is under the Dutch. They could marry. They could actually testify in court against their masters and be called on as witnesses. They were accepted in the Dutch Reformed Church. I believe they went to the church. They might have been separated in the church itself from the white people. And they could be buried in the church grounds. And as far as I know, there might have been a separate section, but that was quite a progressive thing at the time. Now, that is going to be different from how the British did things. Also, in the 1640s, 20 or so years after the first enslaved were brought in 1626, those same gentlemen, the 11, were given partial freedom. They petitioned the company, the Dutch West India Company, to be given their freedom. They were given partial freedom. They were given a plot of land. And they and their wives were partially free, but their children were not free at all. And to stay partially free, they had to pay a fee every year, a certain amount of guilders, to the Dutch West India Company. They could be called on at any time to do some of the work for the company that they did before, like cutting trees and digging ditches and bringing in harvests, etc. So they had an obligation under the Dutch West India Company. So the Dutch did this, it was said, because these guys were getting old. They came in 1626 as slaves, and in the 1640s, they were at least in their 40s and maybe 50s. So elderly, enslaved, then you had to take care of them. They couldn't work as hard. So it would be better to let them go, give them a public land outside of the town. They'd be a buffer between the Native Americans and the Dutch settlers. So they served a purpose to the Dutch West India Company. Unfortunately, when the British took over, it took a few years, but by the early 1700s, these partially free enslaved and their descendants were to lose their land because the British did not allow Black people to own land in the colony. And one other thing, if I didn't mention it, under the Dutch, the enslaved could learn how to read and write. No one put any restrictions on that. So, British period, that's Peter Stuyvesant, I believe, surrendering to the British, and that was in 1664. Okay, now the burial ground itself. There's a possibility, some facts lead to the fact that the burial ground might have been there in the Dutch period, maybe as far back as the 1640s itself, even though they could be buried, the African enslaved, in the cemeteries of the Dutch Reformed Church, but not under the British. In 1697, the Anglican Trinity Church forbade burials of Africans in its cemetery, ordered that after the expiration of 4 weeks from the dates hereof, no Negroes be buried within the bounds and limits of the churchyard of Trinity Church, that is to say, in the rear of the present burying place, and that no person or Negro whatsoever do presume after the term above, limited to break up any ground for the burying of his Negro, as they will answer it at their peril. Okay, now, the first written account of a burial ground was done by Chaplain John Sharp. And this is what he said: buried by those of their own country and complexion in the common field without any Christian office. Perhaps some ridiculous heathenish rites were performed at the grave by some of their people. I believe it was this chaplain who also complained about the noise that the African enslaved were making when they buried their dead. A map of the city showing the burial ground was not drawn until Mrs. Bucknard produced her hand-drawn plan in the 1730s. I believe that's it. And there's the burial ground in that encircled area. That's a more modern map of the area, written on some of the present day or the reports that were done, especially by Howard University, about the African burial ground. And you can see that 6 acres cutting across the freshwater pond, which no longer exists, but it's a pretty soggy area beyond that palisade. Even today, there is groundwater there underneath all the dirt that is there now today. More modern version, there's the same one, but to the left is the burial ground, Broadway, and then between Duane and Chambers. And there's City Hall Park, and there's City Hall and the courthouse. So you see it's not very far up. It's pretty much lower Manhattan. But that's where we are today. That was the full extent of the burial ground. That's not what it is today, where the memorial is there, but only that 1 acre or so. Now the map of New York, it says Order of the Blacks. The farms were most likely up there under the Dutch. I believe that is a Dutch map. But that or a later rendition of it, but that's probably the area there where the African Americans or the African enslaved had their farms under the Dutch. Another view of the city of New York. There it is again. It's pretty far uptown, and you can see the swamp, they call it now, and the burial ground was in that area. Okay. And again, there it is. And here's some views. This is a little later. You see that's Federal Hall, but that would be in the 1790s, most likely, to give you an idea of Lower Manhattan as well. Another view, that's more like 1800. And of course, that's after the Revolutionary War. I'll give you an idea of what New York looked like at the latter part of the 18th century. And we do cover that period towards the end. Now, you'll see it's rather interesting here that there's somebody hanging, and he's not doing that for pleasure, obviously. And that's because this may be the 1740 revolt, but in 1712 in Lower Manhattan, some of the enslaved, and most likely they were more recent gentlemen that came that had just been transported to New York City as slaves. And they revolted and started attacking the enslavers. And so they were to be punished, and they were hung. This is one doing the excavations again, sort of out of sequence, but that's okay. And one of the remains, which you will see more pictures of as we go along. Advertisements for enslaved Africans. To be sold, a black family consisting of a man, his wife, a fine girl about 12, another girl about 5 years old, and a male child. And you notice that the child had to be old enough to run along, do chores, because that's, you got to be an adult very young as an enslaved person. Children in general did as well at the time. And they talk about how nice and neat and sober and quiet the parents are. The man is a great farmer, the woman a good cook and excellent in dairy. Also, some women knew the herbs that helped people when they were ill. So they also sort of did that as well. Eldest girl waits at table, and so on and so forth. The above, though, which makes it even worse, is that they will be sold either separate or together. And here's another one, an excellent Negro wench, about 20 years old, with a male child, 3 months old. She's had smallpox. She can cook, wash, and iron, can be well recommended, and is sold for no other fault than being too fruitful. I guess she just has too many children. And here's actual advertisements, some of them in great detail. On the 30th of January, 1778, a Negro boy named Alec, 15 years of age, went away in a check shirt. He ran off and reddish colored jacket. And they described it, say that he was wearing breeches, stockings, and he had a branding on his chest, R.W. And also a cargo of Negroes on the one on the left. This is 1769, has just been brought in, consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls. And this is where they would be sold, slave market on the foot of Wall Street. British period, and I'm not going to read all that, but the British took control of New York in 1664. They started in a series of laws changing the more lenient. Slavery itself is never really a lenient thing. Just being owned by someone is bad enough. But they put a series of laws. You can't leave the master's house without permission. You couldn't own weapons. You couldn't gather in groups larger than 4. And whites and free blacks could not entertain slaves in their homes, sell them liquor, or take goods or money. You could be whipped if you were a slave in 1692 if you made noise in the streets on Sundays. Again, they couldn't gather in groups. 40 lashes on the naked back of offenders if you were in a group larger than 3. Masters could punish their slaves for any misdeed however they choose, short of killing them or cutting off their limbs. Now, to encourage owners to let their slaves become Christians and to prevent the loss of slaves who had converted, that made some of the enslavers, the people that owned the slaves, a little upset. Because under the original rules of the Duke of York, who was in charge of the colony, Charles II, his brother, who was king in the 1660s, pretty much handed New York over to him. And he certainly believed in the slave trade, the Duke of York. Anyway, he said no Christian could be enslaved. So now you have sometimes the Anglican Church proselytizing and actually giving lessons to the enslaved. That happened a little later on. And a lot of slaves decided they were going to become Christians because of that rule. So it was changed. So that law in 1706 said, even if you're baptized, even if you're Christian, and you're an enslaved person, you're going to stay that way. And any child born to an enslaved mother was a slave for life. Okay, and actually this 1707 took care of the enslaved holding land. And the 1712 revolt, the British started to get even more strict. All their rules were reaffirmed, and any slave conspiring to revolt would suffer a horrible death, and so on and so forth. And to discourage any white people who owned a slave, they had to pay a bond of 200 pounds. Okay, that was to prevent the slave becoming a public charge. 200 pounds was a huge amount of money. Even if you had it, you wouldn't want to pay that. So that was another way to make sure none of the slaves were set free. And so, as you see, it said black funerals had to be held during the daylight. In 1722, that rule was passed. These enslaved had the African burial ground uptown, past today's City Hall. And they did go towards twilight. So that was not enforced as much as possible. And there might be a reason for that. The slaves had no legal control over anything, but they were allowed to bury their dead. And that idea goes way back, that you want to have closure. We say that today. And you want to respect your loved ones who have died and honored them. So the powers that be allowed that. And if you did that, they probably in the back of their mind, if not in the front of it, this would be a way to cut down on resentment. There had been a slave uprising in 1712. And so this would be one way, perhaps, to limit that. Okay, now they said no more than 12 slaves could assemble for a funeral.
Alan, can I interrupt you for a moment?
Yes.
Now, it says that they had to be held during the daylight for their funerals. Was it traditional that funerals were held at all hours of the day?
No, it was usually towards the evening, I believe. So that's kind of strange that they put that in there. And it was not enforced.
Okay.
And they met in larger groups. Could you tell me what time it is? I don't have my watch on.
Sure. It is 3:35.
Okay. There's a lot of material here. So just know that obviously I'm not going to cover all of it.
Okay.
So if you have any questions at the end, if you could just, tell me, maybe I can answer some of them then or next week. This
Okay,
is a very
sounds good.
large
Thank
subject,
you.
and I don't want to rush like I did last time. So,
Okay, yeah.
all
You have
righty.
to stop. You have to stop. Thank you.
So give me a call if I don't realize the time. I guess around 10 of would be the best time, I would assume.
Will do.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, here's some of the jobs that the enslaved did, both under the Dutch and the English. As you can see, they're self-explanatory. This is loading ships. Now, those barrels, coopers were the gentleman called who did barrels and made them. That was a skill. And there were African enslaved who did that skill. Also, some of them came, they knew how to sail. They knew crafts. Some of these enslaved were trained in some of these skills. Later on, many of the white skilled, usually gentlemen, whose trade it was, wanted laws passed to limit the enslaved learning some of these skills. Also, there was I don't know if it was at the place where they sold the enslaved, but actually some of the masters farmed out their enslaved. So if someone wanted a job done, they would pay the owner of the slave, and that slave would go work for them. So that was another thing that was done as well. There you see, that's the African burial ground inside the museum itself. And you're seeing an area there in the museum that when you go there, obviously you will see that. They talk about the conditional freedom I talked about. That was under the Dutch, and granting land to the Africans, which I've also discussed. And there's a larger view of it. When kids come and some adults try it, there's a cooper making the barrel. But this is on a track, this barrel down here, and it's on a slant. So kids would come and push that up to give you an idea of how heavy they were and how the enslaved had to roll them onto the ships in the harbor and to take them off as well. Those barrels were the containers of the cargo ships of the day. So on a small scale, but flour, nuts, anything could be put in there just about that you could carry. That wasn't so large you couldn't get it in there. This, again, this was Mary, and in 1707, and her master, her enslaver, put it in his will that after his death, she was allowed, she lived on the outskirts of town. She might have even been out of the city limits. That might have been a farm. She was going to be allowed to go to town, or he wanted that to continue after his death. She sold some of the things she made. So obviously he had some regard for her, that he was going to put that in his will and hope that his heirs would not stop her from doing that. There is one of the enslaved ladies cooking, taking care of the children. Now, this is an artist's rendition of the African burial ground. I believe in the 1740s, a stockade was put up around New York. And so the African burial ground was outside of the city limits. And that casket there was made out of wood, obviously. Here they are. These were made by the enslaved, most likely, and the remains would be put in there and they could be buried in the burial ground. So that was quite complex, I guess, for allowing the enslaved to do that. But again, this is one of the few areas where the enslaved had some control over their lives, burying their dead. Now, the archaeological significance of the burial ground, and we can go over some of these. Just give me a second. Okay. Now, in the lobby of the Ted Weiss building, and that building is where the museum is today. But in the early part of this century, the federal government had commissions put out for artists to do reflections of enslavement and its ramifications. And that's in the lobby where the original museum was. Now the museum is in the same building, but right outside of that. And this, unearthed by Frank Bender, actually forensic methods were used by studying the skeletons of those found in the burial ground and the artifacts to make these recreations by Mr. Bender of some of 3 of the enslaved. The gentleman is on the top is from Burial 101. That's where some very interesting things were found. It looks like he was a honored person in the slave community. The lady on the right is probably in her 50s, and she was an elder. So that made her very old in the 18th century. So she was respected as well. People would come to her. Perhaps she had some spiritual significance or knew the best herbs to treat people if they were ill. And the lady with the scarf on her head there on the left actually most likely was murdered. They found a bullet hole, I believe, in her ribs. So that's something as well. Burial ground, again, as you see the section of the excavations. Again, this is how it would have looked originally. By the time these were found, a lot of these caskets had pretty much rotted away. And this is rather gruesome. Going to the African burial ground in the museum, you will see pictures of the original site as it was when it was rediscovered. And they are numbered. And as you see, you have children, and children died very young in New York at the time, and especially amongst the enslaved. A large part of them did not make it to adulthood. Infant 8 to 16 months, a child 1 to 2 years, etc. And this is the Burial 101, and this is the gentleman I mentioned. And there's some significance to him, as I said, and we'll talk about that a little further down the line. A bigger view of the recreation of a burial. And you see some artifacts that were discovered. Buttons, links, they call them. And this is in block 154, burial 22. So that is 22. And we'll talk more. This is some of the clothing, especially the enslaved. Now, 40% of the population in New York, I believe, had enslaved at the time in the middle of the century, and that was to diminish. And a lot of these enslaved worked for, shall we say, craftsmen, furniture makers, metal makers, what have you. And some of them were used in those businesses and learned these trades. Also, since most of the enslaved lived in the enslaver's house, in an attic room or a small area, maybe even in a cellar or what have you. When the enslavers went to church, when they went out to their jobs, their businesses, these enslaved had some freedom, more freedom than perhaps those on plantations in the South, and especially in the West Indies. So they were able to get around a bit more than they did, except, of course, when they decided to crack down, like some of the during times of the two big slave revolts, the one in 1712 and the one in 1742. Of course, this is all of them enslaved. And when they were in the coffins that were made especially for them at the present time in the 20th century, they of course were not put in as they were placed in the burial sites where you see them. So this is pretty much as they looked when they dug up the grounds. They were for the most part, in excellent condition, as you can see. And so this was very helpful for researchers. Now, this person here, you see the coin in his eyes. Now, that you might think of that as ancient Greek or Roman or whatever, but it was also done in the 18th century by the enslaved. So you can find coins in their put over to go to their death, to the other life. And these round circular things are rings, I believe. And so that's part of the artifacts that were found in what we're looking at here. And let's see, this was burial. I don't have it out here. But anyway, the researchers, of course, examine and gather evidence about the individuals found. So this is one of the oldest burials. He was up there 55 to 65 years old. His cranium teeth enamel showed poor nutrition in his childhood, as well as disease. Signs of infection and injury affected his arm and leg bones. So he was used in hard labor. So there's an example of what we're talking about as well. And this here is another, this is burial 25. And I believe that is of the lady I was talking about in the sculpture you saw at the beginning by Bender. And there's the bone, I mean the bullet in her rib, and she also had trauma on her skull and broken bones there on her arm as well, or leg. So you could see the aggression, the bad treatment that most of these or many of these enslaved had. Now, there's an artifact, reconstructed finger rings with glass insets, burial 310, and they look quite fancy. Some of these were recreated to put in some of the display cases in the Museum of the African Burial Ground today. These are pins. This is a pin. And these pins, the enslaved were buried in shrouds, in cloth. And so these pins were able to seal up the enslaved's encasements there. These are called links. And here we go. These were all found. This looks like an earring. And some of these look fairly elaborate. But the enslaved, especially in cities like New York, were able to get to some of these things in the town. And some might have even worked as craftspeople and made them. Buttons, a series of buttons that are shown here. And these were also artifacts from the burial ground. Now, burial 101, the gentleman I was talking about, on the coffin lid, there is a symbol called the Sankofa, and you could see it there. And it was formed by nails, and there it is again. And that's the only thing they found like that amongst the 419 they dug up. And remember, that was only a fraction of who was buried there originally. It was within the thousands at least, because the burial ground was there at least from 1712 and probably before. And that means basically to take this object from the past and bring it forward. Now, to me, and perhaps to you guys, that is rather interesting, because that's basically what the African burial ground is doing. It's bringing up the past so you can look at it and see what it means. So we brought up all these remains, found out something about their life, something about the objects they thought were important, and looking at it again. I never knew that there was so much slavery in New York City before I worked at the African burial ground. It wasn't brought up when I went to school. I'm 74, so it wasn't one of the things that we even knew about. And we up here believed this was a Southern thing. And like I said before, the second largest slave population in the North, in New York City. And there he is again, and there is the Sankofa. Didn't mention the name, that's what it's called. There are many symbols from African tribes. Some of them are reflected in the memorial. And this is one of them you will see. And remember, this was not a homogenic group. There were many different tribes, different areas of, mostly from the coast in Africa, in West Africa, but even from the interior as time went on. And remember, one of the very sad things as well is that many of the African tribes and some of the African kings wanted European guns and goods. So they went around enslaving members of other tribes and sold them. There was slavery in Africa as well. It was on a different scale and not as violent as it could be, as it was here in the New World. And it obviously wasn't based on race. The enslavement in New York City and in the North, the excuse was, well, they're Black. The excuse was they came from a different culture, and that culture was uncivilized because it wasn't Christian. And even Islam felt that way as well. Many Islamic traders in Africa sold the enslaved to the Europeans as well. And the Europeans brought them here because they couldn't get enough of their own people to settle and do the work. They tried indentured servants. That worked for quite a bit. There were still indentured servants, I believe, even into after the colonies became a nation. But that couldn't be on the scale of enslaved. The enslaved you had for life, an indentured servant you only had for several years, and then that's it. It was done. So after a while, Native Americans, I believe, and white people could only be indentured servants. No Black person could be as well. And then it just died out. Enslavement took over, pretty much so. There's a Sankofa again. And we'll pass that one up there. We have a lot of things yet. And here are some of the artifacts. I believe the artifact in the center is a shell. Shells were metaphors for the ocean, and water was very important to the enslaved. That's how the spirits traveled. That's how you brought them back so that you can honor them and worship them, etc. And another map. Now, this is the section of African burial ground. This is to look like a prow of a ship, and you see the steps going down, obviously, to the libation chamber. It is a spiral or a circle, and it leads you back to Africa and through the waters of the world. Excuse me. Here's a close-up of some of the symbols that the African burial ground has there encased, incised in the polished granite of the monument. And Africa was a crossroad of almost all religions. And that was reflected in some of their symbolism. Also, the tribes of Africa believed in local gods, but they also believed in a higher God, a God that was above all of them. And so it wasn't so difficult to transfer that to Christianity or even to Islam. Even though they believed in local deities, the most powerful God was a universal one. And that seemed to be universal in Africa as well. Here's a view of as you're coming out of the bow of the ship and going on to the libation area. These are some more of the symbols. This down on the right is one of the coffins, I believe done in Kenya, where the remains were put. So there were 419 of these done. Here's the African burial ground crossing, the original sites crossing a grid of Manhattan as it looks today. And of course, you see the cross and in several places here. And that's what I was talking about, how Christianity wasn't as difficult to spread among the enslaved because there was that belief in a higher God. There's the Sankofa, the heart-shaped object or symbol. And for all those who were lost, for all those who were stolen, for all those who were left behind, for all those who were not forgotten. And that's right on the monument itself. This is one of the things the enslaved did. This was making rope. I think here's an example of that as well, one of the crafts that they did. And here in the middle of the African burial ground, some of the enslaved mourning the loss of their dead ones. Now, this talks about the slave rebellions in New York in 1712 and 1741. And there we see that gentleman hanging there. That's part of the punishment for those that revolted. It's also out of the 13 of them were burned at the stake. And this is the gentleman who was the judge. And he actually said, he wrote in a journal, I don't know if it was this one, that because the people of New York, the white people of New York, were terrified of slave rebellions. The one in 1742, quite a few enslaved or the owners died and were attacked and shot or stabbed. And so he said he was forced, basically, the judge said this, to convict them and throw the book at them, what have you. And that included burning. And he didn't really want to do that, but that's what the law said. So he said to the people of New York, he said, if you're so afraid of a slave revolt, stop bringing enslaved people here to the city, especially young men, because that's, after a while, that was even limited because those were the gentlemen, he said. Those were the people who started the trouble or who did this trouble. So get some other way to do what you wanted to do in your town. Obviously, he wasn't paid too much attention to, even though slavery or the population of enslavement of those enslaved began to go down after mid-century. And in the North, slavery was to eventually die out. Here we go. 3 slaves sentenced to be hanged for complicity in a robbery by Chief Justice Hamden. It says robbery, but this is actually from the revolt. So this is 1741. And this is what they would face after that revolt and after killing many of the enslavers. From May to August 1741, at a marketplace described as lying in a grassy valley, 13 slaves were burned at the stake and 17 were hanged. The executed were interred within a 6-acre burial ground lying a long stone's throw southwest to a marshy ravine. Hundreds were jailed, and 72 were transported to certain death in the West Indies. Contemporaries compared these events to the 1690 Salem witch trial. They had also started burning buildings as well. So they had killed and they had burned. And that sort of takes away the idea that the enslaved were docile. Some of them fought back. Either you escaped, and at certain times, when you were very desperate, you revolted. So here we go. And here's the
Alan,
design.
I just want to tell you that we're running a
Okay,
little bit short on time. I got captivated by what you were saying, so I didn't cut you off soon.
that's okay. Well, I'm glad I got this far. It's a big subject to cover.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could cover some of it briefly next time. I don't know. But if you have any questions, I certainly would cover them.
So I just was reading more about the heart symbol, and it's kind of poetic that the proverb is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten.
Right.
And if you think about that, and how we're revisiting this, it works out perfectly.
Absolutely.
It's kind of really beautiful.
Yes, the only one that was found, any of those, that's the only symbols that were found in the burials. That there might have been more, but that's all they found. So I think that's quite, some people might say it's quite an omen, or quite a thing, just as you were saying.
I had a question for you. So it was 1991 that the construction took place where they found, they unearthed the remains. Now, I was in first grade when this happened, so I have no recollection. Do you remember this in the news? Were you working in the area at the time?
No, vaguely I remember reading about some in the papers. And when they first discovered this, they didn't know what to do. They tried to hide it, the builders of the Weiss. But when more were discovered and it got out, then it caused quite a stir. And the African American community in New York really fought hard to save this burial ground or have some kind of recognition. As you dig deeper, there's groundwater around as well in that area because it was a marsh and that pond. So they went about as far as they really could go. And so that's what they were limited. And most likely they would have to be. And that whole area, since that was 6 acres, probably some of those other buildings are on top of the burial.
Yeah, I'm curious if, I would be fascinated and very interested if any of those buildings were ever to, get demolished, if we'd be able to, unearth a little bit of everything to see if we could find anything else. But I wonder if that's,
well,
even possible.
That's a question in other places where African burial grounds have been found. So I don't know what the results would be. So many of these crime dramas, there's that big courthouse where they come down the steps, and I forget the names of some of them. My wife says she loves those shows. Pardon me? CSI New York, and they whatever that federal building, which is just down the road. You could see it from the African burial ground, and there that 6 acres might even reach into that area.
Oh wow! Okay.
So that's a rather interesting thing as well.
Thank you so much, Alan. This has been wonderful.
Well, I'm glad that I can sort of bring up this subject and people can look at it and make their own conclusions as well about slavery and what it means. But anyway, okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Have a great night.
You too. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.